For decades, archaeologists believed that warfare was invented with farming. The logic seemed airtight. Hunter-gatherers were nomadic. They moved constantly. They didn't accumulate property. Without property, there was nothing worth fighting organized battles over. Conflict existed. Skirmishes, individual violence, territorial disputes. But large-scale organized killing required something more. Settlements, surplus, stakes high enough to justify the coordination. Then, in 2012, a team working near a dry lake bed in Kenya found something that didn't fit. By 2016, when the full analysis was published in Nature, the field had a new problem. Not a skirmish, not a raid, an organized massacre, carried out against at least 27 people, men, women, and children, in 10,000 BCE. Before agriculture reached this region, before the storage of surplus, before any of the conditions archaeologists said were required for war to exist. The theory didn't fail at the edges. It failed at the center. The idea of the peaceful primitive has a long history in Western thought. Rousseau formalized it in the 18th century, the noble savage, uncorrupted by civilization, living in natural harmony. That version has long been discredited, but a softer version survived into modern archaeology. Not that prehistoric people were noble, but that they lacked the organization for systematic violence. Groups were too small, too mobile, too focused on daily survival to dedicate resources to coordinated killing. This was not sentiment, it was structural argument. And for most of the 20th century, it was supported by what the evidence showed. The problem with absence of evidence is that it looks like evidence of absence. For decades, sites showing prehistoric violence were interpreted as isolated events. A single skeleton with a healed wound, a body with an embedded projectile point. Individual violence, not collective. What Nataruk showed was different. Not one victim, 27. Not isolated injuries, systematic ones, consistent across the bodies in ways that indicated planning, coordination, and execution. Not a fight that escalated, an attack that was prepared. The story of where human violence comes from changed in 2016, and the revision is still working its way through the field. Nataruk is a site on the western shore of what was once a lagoon of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, 10,000 BCE. The region was wetter then, more productive, a place where a group of hunter-gatherers might have had real reasons to defend or to take. In 2012, Dr. Marta Mirazón Lahr and her team from the University of Cambridge began excavating. What they found was preserved by unusual circumstances. The bodies had been deposited at the edge of the lagoon and covered by sediment before they could be disturbed. Almost complete. And they told a clear story. 27 individuals. Men, women, children. The skeletal evidence showed blunt force trauma to the skulls, stone blades embedded in bone, signs of bound hands on at least 2 individuals. The wounds were not consistent with a fight. They were consistent with an execution. You're standing at the edge of this lake bed, Kenya, 10,000 years ago. The water is close. The grass comes up to your waist. The light is early morning. The attack has already happened. The bodies are still where they fell. The people who died at Nataruk were not warriors. Their bone density, their positioning, the nature of their injuries. They were a group that was caught, ambushed at or near the lagoon. Some were killed while fleeing. Some were killed while restrained. The attackers came, killed, and withdrew. No artifacts from the attacking group were left at the site. They had a camp somewhere else, a home base, a plan before they arrived. They didn't stumble into this. They walked in prepared. But preparation is what changes everything. Individual violence in prehistory, one person killing another, tells you something about human capacity for aggression. Organized violence tells you something different. It tells you that a group sat together, made a decision, and coordinated their actions toward a shared goal of killing another group. That requires communication, planning, the social structures to sustain a collective decision over time, to gather, to travel together, to attack, to withdraw. These are not primitive behaviors. They are sophisticated ones. The stone blades found embedded in the Nataruk victims were not the victims' own tools. The source material was different. The attackers carried their weapons to this site. They anticipated needing them. When Lahr's team published the full findings in Nature in 2016, the response was significant. Not because the evidence was impossible. Fragments of similar violence had appeared at other sites, but because Nataruk was so complete. The picture it gave was unusually clear. Clarity was the problem. The bound wrists, the projectile points in positions consistent with killing blows, not battlefield chaos. The total absence of disease, famine, or any other explanation for 27 deaths in one location. The weapons were carried there. The coordination was real. The withdrawal was clean. Nataruk was not a skirmish that got out of hand. It was a plan that succeeded. And the people who made that plan lived in the same world, the same cognitive capacity, the same social structures, as every other group of Homo sapiens alive at that time. Nataruk is not isolated. The Crow Creek site in South Dakota, 486 skeletons in a mass grave, dated to 1325 CE, showing systematic butchering of an entire community. The Aspern-Schletz site in Austria, 5000 BCE, 67 individuals killed, skulls fractured, no one older than 60 survived. These sites postdate Nataruk by thousands of years, but they fit the same pattern. Not aberrations scattered randomly across the record, a recurring feature, one that starts earlier than the model predicted. What Nataruk tells us is not that humans are inherently violent. The evidence doesn't support that, and neither does the broader record. Most groups, most of the time, were not engaged in organized killing. The archaeological record from this period is mostly a record of survival, cooperation, and care. But Nataruk tells us that the capacity for coordinated, lethal violence against another group is not something civilization invented. It was already here. In 10,000 BCE, in a world without cities, without property law, without armies. Marta Mirazón Lahr put it carefully after the paper was published. The roots of war, she said, are not in the state, not in agriculture. They are in the social organization of human groups themselves. The capacity is older than any institution we have built to manage it. You're moving through the grass toward the lagoon. You have no word yet for what you are about to do, no category for it in your language. But the calculation is familiar. Your group is here, their group is there, and the resources between you are fixed. Everyone traveling with you has agreed. The math existed before the word for war. Among the 27 individuals found at Nataruk, one was a pregnant woman. She was identified by fetal bones preserved within her skeletal remains. The child was between 6 and 9 months along. Her hands showed evidence consistent with binding. She died near the water. She was not a combatant. She was not in the way. She was targeted. The level of organization required to carry out what happened at Nataruk, to travel, coordinate, attack, withdraw, included, in that calculation, her. And her child. Sit with that for a moment. Not as a historical data point, as a decision made by people who were, cognitively and socially, exactly like us. This is not an argument that humans are uniquely evil or that violence is our defining feature. The same archaeological period that produced Nataruk produced burials of extraordinary care, evidence of people carried when they could not walk, fed when they could not feed themselves, mourned when they died. The record of human prehistory holds both, the care and the killing. The same species, the same cognitive capacity, pointed in different directions. What we know from the Nataruk bones is specific. The attack happened fast. Not all victims died the same way. Some show only blunt force wounds. Some have multiple projectile points. One skeleton shows the person was moving, trying to get away, when they were killed. The evidence of each death is individual. 27 individual deaths, each one distinct, each one documented. Nataruk is one site, one morning, one event. But it is a real one. We tell ourselves that the worst things humans do come from complexity, from civilization, from the pressures that come with surplus, scarcity, and the systems we build to manage both. Nataruk says otherwise. The capacity was not created by civilization. Civilization inherited it, and has spent its entire history trying, imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes catastrophically, to manage something that was already inside us before we built the first city, planted the first field, or wrote the first law. The bones at Nataruk are 10,000 years old. The logic that put them there is not.